In the last session, we looked at ways of communicating with your teenagers, and we concluded our session having looked at the intellectual communication. And I asked you, what do you know about the world of your son? Do you know what website he goes to? Do you know who his friends are? What do you know about what's going on at school? Connecting at the intellectual level is the very basic form of connection. Let's move on to level 2. And level 2, we're calling it material involvement. These are deliberate acts of kindness towards your teenager that makes them feel loved, makes them feel valued, makes them feel accepted. I'm not talking simply about giving them gifts on their birthdays. That's good, but I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about expensive material involvement. No. I'm talking about timely material involvement, doing something fun with your children, doing something productive with your children, reading a book with them. I remember one of our children was struggling in reading, not because they could not read, but because they did not like to read. And so my wife got a book and said she was going to read that book with my daughter. This was actually a fun book to read, but also my daughter had other school assignments to read. So what they did is to get together after school. They would take about half an hour to 45 minutes of a cup of tea, and my wife would read one chapter out loud to my daughter and ask her to read to her the next chapter out loud. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And after a while, my daughter picked it up and began to read on her own. It's not that she couldn't read, she just didn't want to, she didn't like to. My wife, in a sense, got her jump-started. Material involvement, doing something fun together. For you to be effective in material involvement, you have to be, first of all, involved at the intellectual level. You have to know where your child is struggling. You have to know where your child is doing well. Let me give another example. Your son or your daughter is playing basketball, and you show up at school to pick them up from school. And you know they'll be thirsty after basketball, they'll want to drink some water, but you also know that your child likes ice cream or a milkshake. You even know the flavor they like. And so you arrive at school a few minutes before the game ends, and you walk that last bit of the game, and as you're walking back to the car, your arm was on their shoulder and you're saying, man, you did really well. And your son says, oh no, mom, you know we lost that game. But yeah, you played really well. And you get in the car and your son says, mom, I'm so thirsty. And you pull out a 1-liter bottle of water. I brought this for you. Oh, he gobbles the whole thing down. And then you turn around and said, I also brought this for you. And he looks at that. Vanilla milkshake, mom. This is so cool. It gives you a high five. You even know my flavor. You see, that meaningful connection at that point in time, when the child needs something to cool down, makes a world of a difference. That child knows that you know them. That child knows that you know their needs. That child knows that you care. Material involvement does not have to be expensive, but it does have to be timely and well thought through. And as a parent, you need to be able to connect with your children. Now, to avoid a child's resistance to a parent, the parent must first involve himself or herself in the teenager's world before they can expect that teenager to be involved with them in their world. Once you know what this child needs, what this child wants, what makes them tick, and you get involved, you've won the heart of that child. Material involvement is something that really helps. As I mentioned earlier, it does not need to be expensive, but it needs to be well thought through. It needs to be timely. Does this make sense to you? Well, for it to make complete sense, there needs to be a relationship with it. It's pointless to walk in there and have the ice cream or the milkshake and the water and let the child enjoy that, but then you're on the phone the whole time going back home. No, you need to connect intellectually and materially, and the two things go together. Let's move on to level 3. Level 3 of communication, We're going to call this empathetic involvement. Empathetic involvement. Empathy is allowing yourself to feel the thoughts and emotions of others. Now, I know there's some men listening to me who are thinking, hey, is that for men or for women? It's for all people. Trying to understand the unmet desires and sometimes even the foolish plans of your children. Understanding why they act the way they act. Responding with gentleness and empathy so the child does not withdraw. Listening very, very carefully. You know, the teenager must be relaxed for you to be able to connect with them at this level. Now, for some people, exhibiting empathy comes naturally. For others, you'll have to learn. Remember the verse we saw earlier from Proverbs 20 verse 5, a man of understanding. You need to be that person of understanding. A man of understanding can scoop out truth from a child who has closed off to another. And this whole idea of empathy, a child comes from school and they have done poorly in the exam. They says, Dad, I failed the exam. And how do you respond to that? Say, son, I know you studied hard for it. What did you get? And they tell you the grade. Well, how did others perform in this exam? Dad, they all failed. Ooh, they all failed. Yeah. Perhaps there was something wrong with the test. Talk it through. Don't just jump at them and say, well, you know, I pay school fees for you to pass exams, not to fail them. That's how some parents communicate with their children. But what you want to do is to listen carefully until the child feels understood. After all, is that not how you want your children to communicate with you? To listen to you when you are speaking and not to conclude what you're going to say before you have concluded. Now, this takes us to level 4. Now, level 4, we're calling this dynamic involvement. For you to qualify to be involved at level 4, you must have been able to connect intellectually. You must have been able to connect materially. You must have been able to connect at the level of empathy. Because level 4, this is where you get into the teenager's way of thinking and you begin to influence them from within. Are you ready for this? In level 4, you are listening very carefully to what your teenager is saying. You may not agree with them, but you're listening. You choose not to draw a conclusion before you've heard the whole story. You choose to ask questions and to be intrigued by their plans that seem foolish at first. You know, there's a time I was driving and listening to the BBC, and there are two British men talking about how the French always get their way in the UN meetings. And one of them says, oh, you know, when a Belgian comes up and brings this proposal, you know, how he's going to go into India and do this big project in the month of May to July. You know, the British look at it and say, no, that's just a foolish thing. That project won't work. That's the monsoon season. And his friend said to him, but you know why the French get through? And the other man listened carefully as his friend narrated to him how the French get their way in the UN meetings. He says, when the Belgians come and give their proposal, the French take notes, and they take a lot of notes. And as they take notes, they put up their hand and ask questions. They ask the Belgians, did you say you're going to do this project between May and July? The Belgians say, yes, sir. Well, you might consider perhaps starting in September to avoid the monsoon season. And then they ask, did you say that you need $10 million for this project? It's going to take you 4 months. And they say to them, to the Belgians, you may consider doubling your budget because this project is so important. You may actually consider doing it in 8 months and asking for $20 million. What are the Belgians hearing? They are hearing that our project is sound. They are hearing that we can make a few adjustments and get this project sponsored.